Okay, just short. Are you tired? A little bit.
Am I tired of what?
Of being in talking all the time today.
Okay, I normally never talk to anybody, so it's a pleasure to be able to talk to anybody about anything.
So lecturer doesn't talk with anybody, but with himself, kind of. No?
Nah,
Nah.
not really.
Nah. Where are you from, originally?
I was born in Scotland, but I grew up in a place called Newcastle, but I lived most of my life in Holland and in Iceland and a few other
You're a
places.
travel guy. Okay.
I lived 12 years in Iceland and...
Iceland, 12 years. So you should have quite a drinking habits now.
Not at all.
No, really? I'm sorry, kidding.
No, they say that Icelandic people don't drink any more than anybody else, they just drink it all at once.
That's one from 2nd of January till... Okay.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay. The one question, I have my agenda, what we want to tell in Latvia people, but what's your agenda, what you would like to tell? Kind of, I'm like personally asking you, what's your agenda, what you would like to people to know?
People to know. That, I suppose, I mean, in the first instance, that it's possible to actually put things together to... I mean, I'm not... I never really went to school and stuff, so the stuff that I know about, I learned by doing them. And the kind of opportunity that I can give people is that, well, I mean, I have experience that you can't get off a web page, you can't get it from any kind of book. And it's possible to actually learn these things, whereas people have forgotten a large amount of this because they think they can get any answer they want through the internet. But these are not answers, these are just pieces of data, and data is not really information, and information is not understanding. So I'm just interested in the things that I've learned and being able to pass those on to other people.
Okay.
And my agenda is not really an agenda, but my understanding of the word education is the original meaning of the word education. And originally the word education meant to pull out of somebody what was already there that they didn't know was there, and not to stuff them full like a pâté de foie gras goose. And so I don't see it as being an alternative to the present ways of educating, but as a kind of complement to it. In the same way as you don't have alternative medicine anymore. People don't call it that anymore. They call it complementary medicine. And I call the kind of stuff that I do these days as being complementary education. So it's not against what's already there, it's to add to it, and both sides can add to it.
Thursday?
Yeah.
Super. Okay. Just one question before other questions. You came to this concept of not against but complementary because you really thought about that this is like your opinion, or we thought that this is like a way of communication for them not to shut down, for the educational system people not to shut down.
Partly. My experience is that if you fight anything, it gets stronger. So rather than trying to fight something as huge structure like that, it's better to do a quality action on a small level, which can then spread out, rather than trying to take on a huge machine. As we know, structures don't change people, people change structures. So it's a very big mistake to think, like you have a recent history in this country of a big structure not really changing people. And the same in Estonia where I live, and the same in many other parts of the world. And it's the people who actually change the structures, eventually.
Well, okay, I won't go in philosophical right now. My agenda, our agenda, but what we are up to is kind of the same thing. So education is at some point. This point is moving and changing. This structure is changing, but not as fast or deep or whatever
Sure.
as life does. So the question would be kind of change management. Point A, point B. So we are in the point A, and my main question is how we can persuade those who are regulating and kind of keeping system going in education, how to tell them, listen, this is really, we do really need to change, because a lot of guys are telling this.
Yes.
It just doesn't strike them.
Of course not, because it's not framed in the right way. And that's part of the other disciplines that I know about, and those are hypnotherapy, psychotherapy, the study of language, and all these other kinds of disciplines, which show that you don't have to change the content. What you have to do is you have to change the frame of which it's around. So it's all to do with the way you present these ideas. And so if you work in any kind of artistic medium, you realize that people who are artists generally won't listen to businessmen, because they always think that businessmen are these horrible, evil people who are destroying the world, etc., etc. So it's very rare that an artist will actually think about ways to investigate artistic matters in a business-like way. In the same way as business people tend to think of artists as being with their heads in the clouds and their feet off the ground, and they don't really know anything, they have no discipline, etc., etc. But if you put it in a different context, if you put it the same information, the same ideas, but you put a different frame around it, it's possible to actually communicate these things. And one of the kinds of things that I have done quite some work in is negotiation between different parts of organisations, government facilities, businesses and whatever. And very often they actually want the same thing. They just don't know how to talk to each other in the same language. They use different metaphors, they use different ways of presenting things which push the wrong buttons in the other person. And part of the art of this is to actually present things in the same way. You don't talk to everybody in exactly the same way. The way you talk to me is not the same way as you would talk to your mother. The way that you talk to somebody who's a bureaucrat is not the same way as you're going to talk to somebody who works in a shop, etc., etc. You want the same thing. You want the same kind of interaction on a lot of levels, but you don't talk to them in the same way. In the same way as you don't talk to everybody the same way, you don't present what it is that you have. The way I'm talking to you is not the same way as I'm going to talk to a student. The way I'm going to talk to the student is not going to be the same way as I'm going to talk to, etc., etc., etc. You get the idea. So the way that you put these ideas forward is, the first thing is to make sure that you're directing from the point of view of the person that you're speaking to. So you have to get rid of the idea that this way to do things is the right way, and is to step into the other perspectives and find out from that person, before you say a word, the way that they're actually looking at things, and frame it in that way. That's a common technique in all kinds of psychology and all kinds of therapies and stuff, is to find out first from the patient what they expect, and then present them with what you want to give them in a way that they're expecting. We know not only from psychology, but also there's many experiments being done to show that when people go into a situation, they have expectations, and they don't see what they don't expect. This is an extremely important point. For example, most traffic accidents with motorbikes and bicycles are caused not because the bicycle is wearing big flashy clothes or looks different, it's because they look different that nobody sees them. You hear about traffic accidents where the motorcycle came out of the blue, came from nowhere. That's because they're only looking for other cars. You only expect to see other cars. You don't expect to see babies in pushchairs. You don't expect to see these kinds of things. And so the basic psychology is that if you don't expect to see something, you won't see it. So if you are in normal education facilities, you are thinking in a particular way. And if something comes in that you don't expect, you're going to either try to cut the edges off it and try and stuff it into a box that you've already got, or you're going to completely discount it. And there are many, many examples of this where we edit out reality. If it doesn't fit into our reality, we just edit it out. There's a very famous case of this with President Roosevelt in the United States, who had a kind of voice like this, but it was very clear. It wasn't, you didn't talk like this. And he did a little experiment, and there was a meeting at the White House where there was a row of 40 people, and he had to shake each one of these people's hands as he walked along the row. And what he said was, "I murdered my wife this morning. I murdered my wife this morning. I murdered my wife this morning." And nobody heard him, because they weren't expecting the President of the United States to say such a thing. And there are many, many cognitive experiments about this. And my approach to this is to do exactly what I just said, is to take this into account. And if people aren't expecting these new ideas, they won't see them. So you have to present them as if they've been going on forever. That's one thing. That's one way to do it. And not to say it's an alternative to your thing. It's what it is just going to add to it, which immediately takes away a lot of the pressure and a lot of the confrontational possibilities. Because these people are in positions of authority. They have an investment, an emotional, intellectual investment in their position. And if you appear to be attacking it, well, what they're going to do? They're going to resist. So it's not that certain people are going to need certain kinds of massaging. Some people are going to need to be shocked. Some people are going to need to be seduced. All these people need different things. And it's a question of looking at the situation and what is appropriate for that situation. Not as the normal education systems do, is treat everybody like a sausage factory, where it all goes in and it all comes out the same. Like a conveyor belt, which is a product of the education system which we now have pretty much all over Europe and other parts of the world, which is a result of the Industrial Revolution, where people were taught that people were basically cogs in the machine. And there were two kinds of people. There was the poor people who would never learn anything and they were only good for working, and there was the other people who had to learn the classics. Because the scientific method, which is what produced the Industrial Revolution, comes from all of these Greek ideas which were all brought back during the Enlightenment. Okay? So all of this links together into an attitude of being creative with the situation and seeing that certain people require certain things. And instead of going in with one mindset to fit everything, what you do is you look and see what's appropriate for that particular situation and apply what it is that you have in a dynamic way. Make sense?
I suppose it would be enough already. Cool, Andrew. Really compact. Give an example. So the question is, absolutely agree, 101%. The thing is, for example, United Kingdom, educational system is trying to go towards creativity, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
United States, there are kind of ways. And yesterday I read an article in Washington Post that said that, for example, these educational guys are telling and using now word innovation just to like billboard now,
yes.
And there's not a content. And this is like I talked with one guy who is creating some kind of creative movement in England, and they are really good, succeeding. And ministry all the time are asking for measures, and those measurements are they are like on opposite sides. So the thing is, so we understand that. The thing is that, for example, if your grandmother would talk about Eminem, so how much time do she needs to accept or expect Eminem kind of as music style to be accepted? So the thing is about differences, about the scale of differences, because I understand what you're talking about, not argumentation against,
yes.
But just seeking like Bono 6 Hats, for example, from all the sites and look
yes.
for the gains, kind of that.
Yes, yes.
So this is kind of one question about differences.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, in Latvia there is lack of sorry for such a long
okay.
story, but in Latvia there is lack of tolerance. This is one of the basic things. Yeah, and this is when you in society there is lack of tolerance. It means there are really this society is fulfilled with biases, right? Kind of that. Mm-hmm. This is good, this is bad, and black and white. Kind of that. So this is a question about how you talk in compromises and all the gains. How you explain for the people where are the differences so big.
Again, it's a question of you have to judge each situation on its own merits. You have to look at the situation and what's appropriate for that sort of situation. In the case of the grandmother in Eminem, well, of course, there's different ways you can explain a person like that. I mean, you are a man, but you're also somebody's son, right? Now, if we were to talk about this grandmother and we'd say, well, there's this young guy and he does all this kind of stuff and blah, 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 blah. Well, that's probably not going to work. But if we say, well, this guy had a lot of problems with his mother, and we appeal on that particular level, she's going to have a way in to that. I'm just giving you an example off the top of my head. But you would not frame it in the sense of this is a white guy doing black music, etc., saying awful things about his mother in songs and all the rest of it. You just put him as a very troubled man in a very troubled situation in a very difficult period of American history, and you'd frame it that way and you'd put it through that. And that's you're not changing the content, you're just framing it in a different way.
We can say the word selling from my point of view.
Sure,
okay.
Sure.
Do you know some good examples? I just heard, I don't know which country, there was a story that media helped change educational system. Do you recall? So the question is, educational system is suffering kind of, or struggling to move on. Do you know some kind of good examples where it happened and how it happened?
Well, it's mostly in poor countries because, of course, firstly, they're more desperate than anybody else. And the second thing is that they're not used to the metaphors and the structures that we are. Even Latvia still being a sort of relatively recent sort of, into the European thing, etc. Still, it's much more advanced than somewhere like parts of Africa where they don't even have houses to put the schools in. So I have a friend of mine who works in Vietnam, for example, and he actually goes around and he uses a few of the techniques that I know about them. These are none of my techniques, but I mean, these are things that are around. And the fact is that they will look at things in a more open way because they just don't have the preconceptions. They just simply don't have, it's like, does it work or does it not work? Not who said it and is it fashionable to like this idea? No, does it work or does it not work? I mean, that's all they really care about. And they try it out without prejudice, without preconceptions, and if it works, they use it. If it doesn't, they don't. And that's as pragmatic as you can possibly get. And those are where the real successes are happening. And I know, for example, there's, you must know of of Edward de Bono, for example, and the 6 thinking hats has been enormously successful in the huge Fortune 500 companies, but also in solving disputes between South African silver miners, for example. They had an argument that had been going on, a bitter argument where people were dying, where people were being murdered because of this argument, which had been going on for 2.5 years, which was solved in 30 minutes using this technique. Now, when people see that kind of thing, they're going to, not only is the people on the top level are going to look at it, the people on the bottom level, so to speak, are going to look at it too. And it's those kinds of things. Very, very simple ideas which are very deep, rather than very complex ideas which are very shallow, which is what most people are used to.
Okay, cool. The question about the end result of the education. For example, there are 11 years or 12 years or 16 years. Mm-hmm. Okay, we can maybe talk about basic education, not like professional, something like that. Mm-hmm. What would your ideal education would be? Kind of.
It's very, very simple. It would be the development of an attitude. That's about it. I mean, the idea of education is, of course, continuous. I don't really see that there being an end point at all. I mean, I'm learning more now than I did when I was at school, and I hope it always goes on. And I mean, it's a particular attitude, being open to every situation and what can be learned from it, rather than making a separation between now I'm learning and now I'm not learning. To be able to take everyday life and use that as fuel for actual learning, rather than a special situation which happens at a certain time of day for a certain amount of years. That's a very limited view of what education is. Most people will tell you when they get to be 50, 60, 70, is that they now are free to actually really explore all this stuff. Now, why do we have to start then? Why can't it just be a continuous thing? I don't see any reason why not. I mean, I've never done it myself, and I don't really see why anybody should have to do it.
Could you explore a little bit more about attitude?
Attitude is a kind of way that you deal with what happens to you in life. It's a kind of, you can, if you have an open attitude to what happens as input, then you're going to be able to see more possibilities and more perspectives, to use that word again. Whereas if you're only seeing what you expect to see, you're going to live a life which you expect. And if you're looking at it from one particular attitude, that's exactly what will happen to you. It's not some sort of new age kind of thing. I mean, that's what happens in all sorts of, like I said, with the traffic stuff, and with all kinds of projections in science, for example. They now know that if they are expecting a particular set of results, that's what they're going to get. And if another set of researchers do exactly the same experiment but expect something different, that's what they will get. And this is no longer some kind of theory. This is like every time they do it, it just happens like that. So if you expect to know everything like they did in ancient Greek times, which is where we get a lot of the systems that we're using today. At that time, the world was a very small place and there was very little to know. So within 5 years, you could know everything there was to know. Right? You just go to the gymnasium. Athens is 110,000 people. That's all it is. And that's the known world as far as you're concerned. And the Greek conception was that everything is perfect, apart from slaves and women, but we'll just leave that aside. And all we had to do was keep on looking, and we'd find the answers at the back of the book. We'd find the laws which were underneath everything. The whole idea of Platonic solids, that everything's made out of these particular things, and everything else is a result of that. And that everything has a law, an absolutely unbreakable law. Well, this is what the modern scientific method has taken on. This is what it believes in. This is what it thinks, is that there's an answer. Eventually, we just keep on looking. There will be an answer at the back of the book, and we'll understand everything. Trouble is, the more they look, the less they understand. So the attitude of there is an answer to everything puts a stop at the end of the sentence. And of course it never ends. It never really ends. Because there's always something more to learn. There's always some other thing. And that's the attitude. That's a very... flexibility would be the biggest thing, which is part of the creative attitude. It's a willingness to actually use pretty much anything.
Flexibility. I just thought about this word change because there are research that in the Western society, the change is the word what most people are afraid of. Change.
Sure, but that's due to that one theory would be, and which may or may not be true, but I think it has a large amount of truth in it, is that it's due to a lot of survival techniques. We're pattern recognizing beings. We look for patterns that we've already seen. And that's, if you see somebody you recognize, well, okay, you're not afraid of them, you don't run away from them. If you see something you've not seen before, you run away. It could kill you. Right? So when you look at something, it's like, well, do I mate with it, or do I eat it, or do I run away from it? These are the basic things which we're hardwired to do over 300,000 years. So if someone is afraid of change, that's what they're afraid of. But the point is that we actually only learn by things that are different. We don't learn by what we already know. So we're attracted to what we already know, but we actually learn from mistakes. And the Western scientific method, of course, has this huge reliance on proof, on being right or wrong all the time, and not playing around and sort of seeing where this potentially wrong avenue or road might take you. And so it's that openness to what might actually happen. And maybe it seems wrong now, but it may turn out to be very, very useful in the future. Whereas the logical progression is you get A right, then you go to B, then you go to C, and you never ever go back and see, well, maybe we could do B a bit better. And that's why you have large institutions like the education system, like the transport system, like all these things or computer systems. Windows operating system is a great example. The last time I looked, Windows NT, which is, a few years ago now, but that was 10 million lines of code. Now, the investment of time, resources, et cetera, everybody knew it was falling to pieces. There was just no way that this was going to carry on and on and on. It was built on very shaky foundations. But they wouldn't go back and start again because they thought it was going to take too long to do. But if you added up all of the man hours and all the research and all of the problems that they've had, it would have been more profitable to go back and start again. But we don't do that because we have this investment in it. And that's why we get a lot of the resistance with normal situations with education systems, political systems, all kinds of systems, is because they're afraid to go back and change things because they have an investment in what's already gone before. And this works on a personal level as well as on a big structural level as well, where the system ends up only keeping the system going and doesn't do what it's originally supposed to do. Any systems analysis thing will show you that this is the case. The hospital systems, which don't heal sick people, they just exist to push paper around. The education system does not exist to... The amount of time it spends on educating people is about this big, and the rest of the time it keeps moving the wheels around is like this. And you can look at any big system is like this. It's called homeostasis. It wants to keep things running in the same way as it always has. But we know that it's only by differences, like the way you look, like the way you see. It's the differences between the two eyes that gives you the interference patterns between the two visual inputs that gives you the picture. Without it, you wouldn't have a sense of depth. Without it, you wouldn't be able to judge distances. You wouldn't be able to do these things. It's by differences that we learn. It's by making mistakes. When you're a child, you do something, you try it, you get it wrong. It's a feedback loop, examined by things like cybernetics, etc. But the point of it is that change is very frightening because it means that this investment in the past no longer applies. So it's an emotional thing. So arguing logically about why people should change is not going to happen. It's not going to work. You have to appeal to people on an emotional level. There's a good example of applying the way that people operate to get a message across with the same content, but just put it in a different way. There's an example for you.
I had some 70 tendencies to ask or tell or something like that. Really interesting. I agree 102% already.
Okay.
It's growing.
We got up.
The level of trust is growing, man. It's really cool. Okay, but besides maybe homeostasis, this is like the cancer function?
Well, it's a normal function of any living being. It wants to keep things the same. That's what it means. Homeo meaning the same, and stasis meaning a state.
It's like a reptile part of the brain, but likes to repeat something.
That's right.
Kind of that.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
So the main. I'll ask. This is really important, and afterwards I don't know. We can fly like. What we try to explain in Latvia. We try to explain from this point of view that we need balanced education, and balanced is kind of roughly speaking, we need logical and rational and irrational.
Precisely.
And this is like the story that we want to tell, and we try to tell this from functions of the brain, that we have kind of tendencies or trends from one part of the brain rational, one part of the brain irrational.
Sure, that's one way to do it, and for some people that will work, of course, but for some people that will be seen as a threat. You basically have to examine the belief systems and the way that they talk, the way they see the world, etc., etc. Talk to them for a while, find out how it. And this is very, very important, because you don't get a second chance at a first impression. So when you talk to these people who are actually in positions where they can control these things, you've got to make damn sure that you get it right the first time, that you explain this in a way that they can actually see, oh, right, I know this, I feel comfortable with this. And then you can start to introduce all the kind of slightly strange things. It's a little bit like hypnosis, where you get people focused and focused and focused and focused, and then you can introduce things that they normally wouldn't accept, or they wouldn't normally look at. It's the same with when you seduce someone, you gradually narrow in and narrow in and narrow in, and gradually things develop that wouldn't normally have developed. When people feel comfortable.
Okay, so let's talk. If we can talk about this balanced education, if we can feel that, for example, it can work in Latvia, we are taking this as a one tool is to say this is scientifically proved.
Sure.
So this is like the statistics and science, and again Western culture that says that kind of that. So what's from your point of view, from your practice, what have you seen that how this balanced education is like more effective as this more rational way to teach?
Well, you have to look a little bit on the long term. It generally doesn't show. You see, this is one of the difficult things: is it doesn't really show up in the short term very often. It's a long-term change, because a lot of these things are very deep things that have to change, about belief systems, about how the world is, all sorts of structures which have been put in there since childhood or by society or whatever. Each environment, each society is very different. But there are these common threads, especially in Western society, more or less everywhere now, but mainly in Western society. And so the balance is, in a way, you kind of have to push the other way first before it will kind of balance itself out. A bit like a pendulum, which swings very much this way, very much the other way, but gradually it comes back to a level part, if that makes sense. So you have to show people that this has been done for a very long time. Some people, that will be a good proof for them. So you say, well, all of the major inventions of the world are basically accidents. That's, for some people, that's a really good one, because they never thought about that. Penicillin, accident; X-rays, accident; the telephone, accident; television, accident. All these things, they're all accidents. Just look them up, And there's people messing around with things they shouldn't have messed around with. Physicists doing things in biology, or Alexander Graham Bell sending off the patent about some submarine communication thing and misunderstanding it because it was in German and he didn't speak German, and inventing the telephone. Right? Or the X-rays, where they left off a metal plate that they should have put on, and we get X-rays, and so on and so forth. Many, many things like that. The Polaroid camera was Edwin Land, who invented the Polaroid camera, was taking photographs of his family, and the kids said, why can't we see the pictures now? You thought, why not? Right? And it's those kinds of things. Now, you can appeal to some people on that level, and you say, well, look, people have been doing this forever. And half of the things you're using in your everyday life come from accidents. What about if you could make those accidents happen when you want? And then some people are really going to grab that idea and they're really going to go for it. Some people are going to be impressed with the scientific stuff. Some people are going to be, you can give them personal demonstrations where you give them a problem in their own personal life and you show them how to solve it by introducing random elements into it. I mean, there's loads of different ways to do this. And each person is going to react differently. And I've spoken to many, many people from up and down and left and right and all the rest of it. And generally there's a way to find a common ground and then introduce this. But you can't just walk in and just sort of expect to spread it around like peanut butter. It's not going to. It just won't work. Some people will take it and some people won't. And some people are allergic to nuts.
Okay, I'm just looking for a companion right now here because we are trying I'm working in media for 15 years kind of. I know the trends that people like this or that, and for example, we have a lot of guys in Latvia who are telling the same. That, for example, as Finland is doing right now, they are adding arts. So this subjective
Sure.
inner feelings to the learning process hugely, not just like 10%, like 30%.
Okay.
And this is like what we are trying to tell in Latvia that, for example, in Latvia there are research that people are mostly tended to be on the right brain associations, but the education is quite opposite, right?
Sure.
So actually people can understand some subconsciously or something like that. So if you can tell Andrew some kind of your arguments, whatever concepts or attitudes that this right brain stuff, this art stuff, this music stuff, this is really necessary in the educational process.
Well, there's already a kind of acceptance about that, but it's not where you would think of looking. And one interesting thing to consider is that actually most of the things that we get, that we are using, come as a result of the military. And the interesting thing about the military is that it's the only sector of public spending where they don't have to account, where it's perfectly possible to experiment and do all sorts of crazy things as long as it might result in something useful. And the American military, for example, has produced all sorts of things which have got nothing to do with what they originally were for, but they're just a byproduct of this process of spending millions and millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars on messing around. And it's the only place where large amounts of money get to be spent on creative things. That's the only place.
Advertising?
That's not spent on by the government, is it? The government doesn't spend money on advertising, or not very much anyway.
Okay.
Right? But research into weird things, that's millions and millions going, and it's a big black box, and you're not allowed to know what they're spending it on. It's the only place where real creativity gets sponsored. So there is actually an area of life, which most people don't even look at, where there is large investment into those things. And one of the ways to do it would be to make education a bit like the military. So you don't present it to them as that people have to learn things, you present it to them as an opportunity to get something out of these people who are in the education system that they might be able to sell. Right? It's just a different way of framing exactly the same thing. There are many different ways to do it. There's one, which I just came up with. I didn't think about it before, but that's one way to do it.
Okay, maybe you can make a fool of ourselves. We have an agenda this summer to invite something like 20-25 youngsters, age 18-22, and to make courses like lectures and 2 weeks through what they can experience and get the feeling of social responsibility. So this is like something like really broad and abstract, but in this term we want to put in communication, responsibility, to understand how the system works. You are dependent from other people around. You need to be proactive in social system. What do you think about this? What is really necessary? And I don't know. It would be kind of, nothing beside my 5 sentences about that. What would you say is really like key things for social responsibility in the people?
Social responsibility? Well, this is all Latvian children, I suppose, yes?
Yes, for the first time, yes.
Okay. Well, apart from the specifics of the Latvian situation, which I don't really know very much about, obviously, because I don't live here and I don't really know very much about what's going on in those kind of areas. Social responsibility is not really a mental construct as far as I'm concerned. I mean, social responsibility is something that you experience. It's not really. So my approach to something like that would be to make certain situations where they weren't actually being told that they were learning about social responsibility, that they were actually doing it, and then you tell them afterwards. So that would be my way of doing it, for example. And of course, I would look at, obviously at certain ages there are certain kinds of preferences or things like that. So I would look at what kind of group we've got, what kind of economic backgrounds, all those kinds of things, because different layers of society respond in different ways because of their training and stuff like that. But I would make it so that it was an experience rather than they were being told anything. I would trick them, if you want to use that word, I would trick them into doing something and then tell them afterwards.
Agree, absolutely. The question, besides that, is a question about learning to cooperate, right? Because social responsibility is cooperation is really necessary, right?
Yeah, sure. Well, that again is another experiential thing and not really an intellectual thing, especially for younger people. And as I said before, the main thrust of all of these modern medias is to separate people and not actually to bring them together. It gives this illusion of bringing people together, but really what it's doing is pushing them further apart. There's no accident that they're called Facebook and MySpace and I this and I that. It's all about personal connections. But they aren't really connections. They give the illusion, just like pornography does. It promises and promises and promises. It never really delivers anything, not anything real. So on these social media things, you have everybody's photograph is the same size, and if you don't like what they say, you just delete them and they're gone out of your life forever. So it brings the value of people down in a very, very dramatic way, where it's people that collecting postage stamps for a lot of people, where people have so many friends who they've never even met. So there is a hunger for that. That's why these things exist, but they don't ever deliver. They don't ever really deliver in the real sense of the word. So taking structures like that and actually flipping them over and doing the exact reverse, which is one technique, of course, which works very well, would be to actually try to push them apart and get them to feel this way that they want to connect. Rather than try to force them to connect, actually try and push them apart and see just how much they actually miss being in that situation. One of the things that I learned in the last few years, I often wondered what young people were getting excited about in the way that I got excited when I was a teenager. And I couldn't work it out. Because music is free, basically, so it's not that. All these kind of experiences that I had, which were like once a month or every 2 months, they can have them 24 hours a day if they want. And, consequently, they don't get excited about them because they're not special anymore. If something's free, it's not worth anything, right? So there's a bell curve now, which used to be the other way around, where people wanted the best thing for the best price. So it was a kind of average, right? Wasn't very expensive, wasn't very cheap. It was a kind of in the middle. The bell curve now goes the other way. So people only want something if it's free or if it's very, very expensive. Average doesn't cut it at all for anybody anymore. So especially with younger people, as far as I understand it, what you have to do is appeal to one of those extremes and work with that. So you either have to make them very, very connected, so you put them in some kind of survival kind of situation where they've got to cooperate, or you make it so that they can't talk to each other. So you make the connection, you make it actually a very free thing, so it doesn't cost them any effort or anything, or you make it so that it's very, very expensive, that they've really got to think about it before they're even allowed to do it. And then people get to feel the value of something rather than just have it as an intellectual process. So that would be now you've asked me, I'd never thought about it before, but that would be, off the top of my head, the way I would start to approach the problem, or the situation, let's put it that way.
Okay, we have some concept about this, need to think about it. Just other last thing about this is communication.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like not argument against argument, but just to create together.
Sure.
What about that?
Well, you would then. Communication is. We know that communication is much more complex than just what people say. So I would. One thing I have done. This is one thing I have done a lot with people, is to get them to concentrate on all the things that they normally are responding to, but are not conscious of. It depends on who you read, but the figures are pretty much the same. The communication is 7% words, 35% intonation, that's the way you say something, and the rest is body language. Whereas the internet, pretty much all the time, you've got 7%. That's why you have all these emoticons, all these smileys, all these other kinds of things. It's because it's not possible to actually see these things. You must have seen these, for example, those impossible things, those impossible pictures where you've got like a picture and it looks like a young woman, and then at a sudden moment you suddenly realise it's actually an old woman as well. Now a computer can't tell the difference between that. That's the interesting thing. Computers don't understand jokes because it's seeing things from a different perspective which they don't fit, and a computer can't do that. And if you work through a computer, you're operating on the metaphors that a computer uses, which is on, off, black, white, yes, no, us, them. right? It's binary. That's its whole nature. You can have this or you can have this, and there's nothing in between. Now, communication is all about the in-betweens. It's not about the yes, no, black, white, on, off. It's not about those kinds of things. And you have that, I'm sure you have it in Latvian, you have it in all other languages. Other languages are built differently. Chinese is all about the intonation. You can't do what I'm doing as speaking in English and giving things emphasis. You can't do that in Chinese because the meaning is contained in the tonality. The word Dao can be said Dao, 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 Dao. These all mean four completely different things. So you can't express things in the same way. So they do it with their eyes. It's huge for Chinese and Japanese people. It's not about the physical, the words or the intonation. It's all about the eyes. And so on and so forth. So you would operate on a level with communication, which to show people what real communication is, you would not allow them to speak, for example. They have to express some particular idea. You get them to concentrate on body language. There are what are called micro-expressions, for example, that people make, and teach them about that.
Exactly.
And so on and so forth. Yeah, sure. I studied with him for a while, so I know all about that. So there are all sorts of possibilities about that. It's just basically turning the whole thing upside down, inside out, right, so that you get a different perspective on what it means to really communicate. Mm-hmm. And it's like when you go on holiday. You see where you live completely differently when you return from holiday. We know, as I keep saying, we know that the first book about water wasn't written by a fish. If you're not able to step outside your environment, you have no idea what it is. So if you want to learn about communication, step outside it. And then you'll find out what it is.
Cool. I'm really tiring using computer and reading, and this is like lack of energy, really. Mm-hmm. And therefore I suppose that people are getting fatter, for example, if they use computer not because they're eating or something like that, but they're just lacking energy. It's like a story about that.
Well, all of these things are a kind of consumption. I mean, they're all input. And in various systems around the world, I mean, food is one kind of input, one kind of fuel. Air is another one. And impressions, that is what you see, what you hear, what you smell, these are another kind. And all of these things have to be digested. All of these things have to be processed. And there's waste matter comes from all three of them. And most artistic product is waste matter. It's people basically taking in impressions of other people's work and just chewing it up, and they can't digest it, so they just vomit it back out again. Most Western art is basically just vomit. It is. When I hear modern music, I'm hearing somebody's record collection. I'm not really hearing them. I'm hearing their reaction to their record collection. They haven't processed it, so they just spew it out. Modern writers. The last few books I read, these were just cut and paste from other people's work. That's basically what it was. There's these people who have been impressed by something which came from somebody, and they just don't have time. Nobody has time, as we know, to process these things, to really digest and assimilate and make something new out of them. They just put them back out again. And that's the same with political systems, with the way that people approach doing traffic planning in cities, all the way. It's like what went before, just more of the same. One definition of insanity is if you keep on doing the same thing again and again and again and expect a different result. And that's exactly what happens with these things. We'll just do it more. And of course we see the results all over the place. I think there's a lot of hope for it because, as I say, there's a big hunger for all of these things, and you can see the results of that in the names that people give to things, the kind of things that they try to do. So there's a hunger for it. It's just a question of putting it in the right slot and giving it to people in the way that they can understand it, and then you do all the other stuff later. You have to get people interested. You have to sugar the pill, as you used to call it. And that's not in a kind of dictatorial way. That's just basically the way you would sell anything. You have to make people attracted in some way. You have to advertise it in some way. And you have a particular section of society who you're appealing to. You can't make something for everybody. It's just not going to work. People have tried. And it may have worked better, let's say, 50, 60 years ago, but today you really have got to target certain groups and speak their language and understand exactly how they are thinking and how they're operating in the world and their belief systems and all the things that go along with that, all the baggage they're carrying. Once you understand that, you can shape what it is that you want to put across in their particular way.
Cool. Great, thank you.
Okay.
The postscriptum question. We are looking forward to creating some kind of additional educational system, so complementary educational system. So we are not going to, I don't know, destroy or something to do with educational system as it is, because we cannot do this, and we need to negotiate and whatsoever. It will take years. We are just trying to make these short courses, some like 2, 3, 4 weeks, and to give additional bonus or upgrade for the people in these terms of social responsibility, etc. And would you be interested in checking out our concepts or whatsoever? Because I don't know, we are ready to experiment.
Sure.
Kind of that.
Of course. I mean, the more that I get to explore these things and share these things that I've learned from experience, and if it can help anybody else, that's all I really care about.
Okay. We have 2 weeks at the end of July, beginning of August, near border of Estonia, in Salisbury, and we have this camp, and kind of that, 25 youngsters.
Okay.
Kind of that, yeah.
Sure.
I'm hearing this question about this kind of aggressive, let's say this, to take away or one was survival kit, yes, to gather, to get to cooperate, and other one was like to take away communication to get the necessity to communicate, kind of that, yeah.
Sure.
It's interesting, yeah, it's interesting, because we for now we just looked for the way how to, let's say, to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And to sell, not to go in, but sell when they are in for the first two days to calm them down, and afterwards to sell step by step.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the question: does it work? Because I just read one of your PDF files about this step by step question: how does it work, or does it work at all?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the big question about how to pull out education, not to stop not to give the stuff, not to, I don't know, to stick the information.
Well, again, I would have to know a little bit more about the sort of social situation or whatever it is in Latvia, which of course I don't know so much about. But of course, you have to just appeal to the strongest instincts of the people involved. That's really all it is. I mean, I don't know if it would work. I mean, here's one thing. For example, you can just make it.